The maid slipped a folded note into my hand while setting down the salad bowl, and the 2 words written inside it made the room feel 10 degrees colder: run now. For a moment I simply stared at the small piece of paper resting against my palm, feeling the faint tremble of my fingers as if they belonged to someone else. I was sitting at the long walnut dining table in my son Daniel's beautiful suburban home just outside Hartford, a house that smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh rosemary chicken. The chandelier above us glowed warmly, the table was set with polished silverware and crystal glasses, and soft jazz music drifted from somewhere in the background. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Across from me, my daughter-in-law Olivia was smiling in that smooth, practiced way she had perfected over the years, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel sat beside her, carefully slicing his chicken as if the angle of his knife required his full concentration. No one noticed the note. Or at least they pretended not to. I folded the paper slowly and slipped it into the sleeve of my cardigan. At 68 years old, I had learned something important about fear: the worst thing you can do is show it too early. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked suddenly, glancing up at me with a polite expression that felt rehearsed. "You look a little tired." I smiled gently and took a sip of water before answering. "Just a long drive," I said. It had taken me a little over 90 minutes to reach their home from my small house near Springfield, a drive I had made dozens of times before. But tonight's invitation had come strangely last minute. Daniel had called that morning and insisted I come for dinner. Olivia had apparently prepared something special, he said. A family evening. A chance to talk about the future. At the time, I thought maybe they simply missed me. Now, with that note pressing lightly against my wrist, the phrase, "talk about the future," sounded very different. Olivia leaned forward slightly, refilling my wine glass before I could object. "You deserve to relax tonight, Margaret," she said warmly. "Daniel and I were just talking about how much you've done for this family over the years." That sentence should have felt like gratitude. Instead it sounded like the opening line of a speech. I nodded politely and glanced toward the kitchen doorway where Rosa, the housemaid, had disappeared only seconds earlier. Rosa had worked for Daniel and Olivia for almost 2 years. She was quiet, efficient, and rarely involved herself in family conversations. Yet she had just risked slipping me a warning in the middle of dinner. "Run now." The words echoed in my mind while Daniel began talking about real estate prices and retirement communities, his tone light and conversational. I noticed how carefully he avoided saying certain things directly. Instead he spoke about comfort, convenience, peace of mind. Olivia added small comments here and there, each one sounding reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a story. A future where I might be happier somewhere else. Somewhere easier. Somewhere smaller. I listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, but inside my thoughts were moving faster than they had in years. Rosa would not have written those words without a reason. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't reckless. If she believed I should leave immediately, something was wrong. Very wrong. I glanced down at the table. Daniel had placed a neat leather folder beside his plate, the kind people often used for documents rather than dinner menus. I had not noticed it before. Olivia followed my gaze and quickly reached across the table, sliding the folder a few inches closer to Daniel with an almost casual movement. "We'll talk about that later," she said lightly. "Tonight is just about family." Just about family. Another sentence that sounded warmer than it felt. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet hum of the room settle around me. The clock on the far wall ticked softly. Outside the large dining room windows the evening sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the streetlights had begun to glow along the quiet suburban road. Everything looked calm. Everything looked safe. Yet my heart had begun to beat with a slow, steady awareness that reminded me of something my late husband used to say when he ran his construction company. "If something feels wrong in the foundation, Margaret, you don't wait for the walls to crack. You check the structure." I missed him deeply in moments like this. Robert had always been the one who read people clearly, the one who noticed when someone was building a plan. behind polite smiles. But he had also taught me something else during our 40 years together. Pay attention. Trust quiet signals. And never assume you're the only person in the room who understands what's happening. I reached for my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth slowly, giving myself a moment to think. If Rosa had warned me, she must have seen something. Perhaps she overheard a conversation. Perhaps she saw those documents in that leather folder before dinner began. Whatever it was, she believed I was in danger of walking into something I didn't understand. So I did the last thing Daniel and Olivia would expect from an older woman they thought they could manage. I relaxed. I smiled. I let them believe their evening was unfolding exactly as planned. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't to run from a trap. Sometimes the smartest move is to stay very still and watch who closes it. I kept my smile steady and my voice calm while Daniel continued talking about retirement communities as if the subject had appeared naturally over dinner instead of being carefully placed there like a chess piece. He described a quiet complex about 40 miles south of where I lived, a place with walking paths, organized activities, and medical staff nearby. Olivia nodded at every detail as if the idea had been forming for months, which it probably had. I listened politely while cutting a small piece of chicken and bringing it slowly to my mouth, giving myself time to think. The note from Rosa pressed lightly against my wrist like a quiet reminder that this dinner meant more than polite conversation. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "We just want to make sure you are comfortable in the coming years," he said in a careful tone. "That house of yours is a lot to maintain. The driveway alone is nearly 50 yards long, and winters in Massachusetts are not getting easier." I nodded again because he was not wrong about the snow. My driveway had required 3 shovelings during the last storm. But something about the way he said the words comfortable and maintain made them sound less like concern and more like preparation. Olivia lifted her glass of white wine and smiled warmly. "It would also give you more time to enjoy life, Margaret. Less responsibility. More peace of mind." Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. I noticed she had not touched her food very much. She kept glancing toward the leather folder beside Daniel's plate. Every few minutes her eyes moved there and then back to me as if she were measuring the distance between patience and impatience. I slowly set down my fork and dabbed my napkin against my lips. "It does sound peaceful," I said gently. "But I have always believed decisions about moving deserve careful thought." Daniel nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Of course," he replied. "That is why we wanted to talk tonight." He reached toward the leather folder but did not open it yet. His hand rested on top of it for a moment as though he were reminding himself that the moment was approaching. I glanced toward the kitchen again. Rosa was standing near the sink rinsing dishes even though dinner was not finished. She kept her head lowered, but for a brief second she lifted her eyes and looked directly at me. The message in that look was clear. "Be careful." I returned my attention to the table. My husband Robert used to say that the most revealing part of any negotiation was not what people said but what they assumed you would believe. Daniel and Olivia believed that I was an aging widow who did not fully understand legal paperwork or financial planning. They believed that if they spoke slowly enough and wrapped their plan in concern I would follow their lead without asking too many questions. That belief might have been their first mistake. Daniel finally opened the leather folder and turned it toward me. Inside were several neatly printed documents clipped together at the corner. The pages looked official, filled with paragraphs and signature lines. "Nothing urgent," he said casually. "Just a few documents that help families plan ahead. Things like medical directives and property management. You know, in case anything unexpected ever happens." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "It is simply responsible planning," she added. "Many families do this once parents reach retirement age." I looked down at the papers without touching them. The words were small but clear enough to read from where I sat. I recognized phrases like authority, financial oversight, and asset management. The type of language lawyers used when someone wanted legal control over decisions that were not theirs to make. Daniel slid a pen across the table toward me. "You do not have to decide tonight," he said, although his tone suggested he hoped I would. But we thought it might save everyone time if we explained it together. I picked up the pen slowly and turned it between my fingers as if I were considering the offer seriously. In truth, I was listening to every small detail in the room. The ticking clock on the wall. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The quiet movement of Rosa drying dishes. Most of all, I was listening to the tone in Daniel's voice, searching for the place where concern ended and expectation began. "Before I sign anything," I said calmly, "I would like to read it carefully." Olivia smiled again, though the corners of her mouth tightened for just a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." I lifted the first page and began reading line by line. The legal language was familiar enough. Robert had shown me documents like this years ago when he organized our estate planning. Back then he insisted that I understand every clause because, as he once said, paperwork is where quiet mistakes become permanent ones. As I continued reading, I noticed something that confirmed my growing suspicion. These papers did not simply prepare for emergencies. They transferred decision-making authority immediately once signed. Financial accounts, property oversight, medical consent. Everything would shift from my name into Daniel's control. I placed the paper back on the table and looked up at my son. "You certainly came prepared," I said softly. Daniel smiled, relieved perhaps that I had not protested yet. "We just want to help." I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Inside my sleeve the small note from Rosa brushed against my skin again. "Run now." But I was not going anywhere. Not yet. Because the more I looked at the carefully arranged dinner table, the neatly printed documents, and the hopeful expectation in Daniel and Olivia's eyes, the clearer one truth became. This evening had been planned long before I arrived. And if they believed I would walk blindly into their plan, then the most useful thing I could do was let them keep believing it for a little while longer. I kept my expression calm while the papers rested on the table between us, their neat lines of legal language glowing softly under the warm light of the chandelier. Daniel watched my face carefully, waiting for some sign that I understood less than I actually did. Olivia sat beside him with her posture straight and composed, though I noticed the faint tension in her shoulders each time my eyes moved back to the documents. I turned another page slowly, letting the silence stretch across the room. Silence has a way of making people reveal more than words ever could. After a few seconds Daniel cleared his throat. "It is all standard paperwork," he said gently, as if reassuring a nervous client. "Mostly it just makes things easier if you ever need help managing accounts or property." I nodded while tracing the lines of text with my eyes. The language was polite but unmistakable. The moment my signature touched those pages, Daniel would gain immediate authority over my finances and property decisions. Authority that could not easily be undone. Robert had warned me about arrangements like this many years ago while we sat together at the kitchen table reviewing estate plans. I could still hear his steady voice explaining that documents were like doors. Once you opened the wrong one, you might find it difficult to close again. I placed the papers down gently and folded my hands together. "It certainly looks thorough," I said calmly. Daniel seemed relieved by my tone. Olivia smiled again, though this time the smile appeared a little faster than before. "We only want to make sure everything is organized," she said. "You should not have to worry about paperwork at this stage in your life." At this stage in your life. The phrase floated in the air like a quiet judgment. I leaned back slightly in my chair and glanced around the room again, taking in the details that might have escaped me earlier. The dining room had always impressed visitors with its polished hardwood floor and wide windows that faced the quiet street outside. Tonight the curtains were partly drawn, and the neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the glow of the streetlights. Everything seemed normal. Yet something about the arrangement of the evening felt deliberate. The documents were already printed and clipped together. The folder was waiting on the table before dinner even began. This conversation had been prepared long before I drove 90 miles to arrive here. My eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen again. Rosa had finished drying the dishes and now stood near the counter with her hands resting lightly on the edge. She was pretending to organize utensils, but I could tell she was listening carefully to the conversation in the dining room. When our eyes met for a second time, she gave the smallest shake of her head, almost invisible to anyone who was not looking directly at her. The warning was still active. I turned my attention back to Daniel. Before signing anything, I said evenly, I would feel better if I spoke with a lawyer. Just to understand every detail. The reaction was subtle but immediate. Olivia shifted in her chair and Daniel's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of his napkin. Neither of them had expected that response. Daniel recovered first. Of course you can, he said quickly. There is no rush. But the way he said the word suggested that he had hoped for a very different outcome tonight. Olivia reached for the wine bottle and poured a small amount into my glass even though it was already half full. It is simply a precaution, she added. Families trust each other with these things all the time. I lifted the glass and watched the pale liquid move gently inside it. Trust. That word had been used many times in our family over the years, sometimes sincerely and sometimes as a way to encourage silence. Robert used to say that real trust never demanded signatures in a hurry. I placed the glass back on the table and gently closed the folder, sliding it a few inches away from me. I appreciate your concern, I said. But decisions about property and finances deserve patience. Daniel nodded again, though his smile had grown thinner. Naturally, he replied. We just thought it might be easier if everything was arranged tonight. There it was again. Tonight. The emphasis on a single evening. As though timing itself was part of the plan. I rested my hands calmly in my lap while the quiet hum of the house settled around us. Somewhere in the kitchen a faucet turned on briefly and then off again. The clock on the wall ticked softly, measuring seconds that suddenly felt more significant than before. Rosa's note brushed lightly against my wrist beneath the fabric of my sleeve. Run now. But leaving suddenly would raise questions, and questions might reveal fear. Fear would give Daniel and Olivia an advantage. Robert had taught me another important lesson during the years we ran his business together. When someone expects you to walk away from the table, staying seated becomes a form of strategy. I looked at my son with the same gentle expression I had used when he was a child struggling with difficult homework at the kitchen table. Tell me something, Daniel, I said quietly. Did you and Olivia plan this conversation today, or has it been on your minds for a while? For a fraction of a second his expression changed. The answer appeared in that brief pause before his voice returned. We have been thinking about it for a few weeks, he admitted. Olivia nodded in agreement, though her eyes moved quickly toward the closed folder again. That confirmation told me everything I needed to know. The dinner invitation, the printed documents, the carefully chosen words about comfort and convenience. None of it had been spontaneous. This evening had been designed step by step. I lifted the folder once more and held it lightly between my hands. Then I am glad we talked about it, I said gently. Because planning is always better when everyone understands what is happening. Daniel relaxed slightly, perhaps believing the conversation was returning to the direction he preferred. But inside my thoughts another understanding was forming, steady and clear. If Rosa believed this dinner was a trap, then the true purpose of these documents might only be the beginning of what Daniel and Olivia intended tonight. And if that was the case, then the most important thing I could do now was exactly what they least expected. I would keep listening. I would keep watching. And I would make sure that whatever plan had been prepared for this evening did not end the way they imagined. I let the folder rest quietly on the table between us, as though the papers inside it were nothing more than routine documents that could wait until another day. Daniel seemed relieved that I had not pushed the conversation further, and he leaned back in his chair with the kind of careful calm people use when they believe a difficult moment has passed. Olivia reached for the serving dish and offered me more chicken, her smile returning with polished ease. Please have a little more, she said. You barely touched your dinner. I thanked her softly and allowed a small portion onto my plate even though my appetite had faded. My thoughts were moving somewhere else entirely. The warning from Rosa had not come from nowhere. A woman like her did not risk interfering in family matters unless she believed something serious was unfolding. The house itself felt slightly different now that I was paying closer attention. Earlier it had seemed warm and comfortable, the way Daniel had always kept it. But now I noticed the quiet details that had been invisible before. The dining room door behind me was fully closed, even though Daniel usually preferred it open when guests were visiting. The hallway lights were on, creating a soft path of brightness that led toward the front entrance. And somewhere upstairs I thought I heard the faint movement of footsteps, too quiet to belong to anyone sitting at this table. Daniel followed my glance toward the staircase and then quickly returned his attention to his plate. It was a small reaction, but it told me enough. Someone else was in the house tonight. I took a slow sip of water and set the glass down carefully. "This meal is wonderful, Olivia," I said sincerely. "You have always had a talent for hosting." Her smile widened slightly, though the compliment did not distract her from watching me. "Thank you, Margaret. I wanted tonight to feel special." The word special lingered in the air. Daniel cleared his throat again and reached for the folder, sliding it closer to himself now that it was clear I would not sign anything immediately. "There is no pressure," he said. "We can revisit it another time." His tone suggested patience, but I could sense the disappointment underneath it. Whatever they had expected tonight had not happened yet. Yet. That word remained important. I rested my hands lightly in my lap and listened again to the quiet rhythm of the house. The clock continued its steady ticking. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights moving briefly across the dining room curtains before disappearing again. Rosa walked into the room carrying a tray with small dessert plates. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all evening, but when she placed a plate beside me her fingers brushed the edge of the table. For a moment longer than necessary. It was subtle, but the message was unmistakable. "Be alert." I thanked her softly and looked down at the slice of pie she had served. Apple, still warm, with the faint scent of cinnamon. Normally I would have enjoyed it. Tonight it was simply another detail in a room full of details that suddenly mattered more than usual. Daniel picked up his fork and began speaking again, this time about lighter subjects. He mentioned a renovation project at his office building and a conference he planned to attend in Chicago next month. Olivia added comments about travel and restaurants as if the earlier discussion about legal authority had been nothing more than a passing topic. Their performance was careful and polished. But beneath the conversation I could feel the quiet structure of their plans still standing in place, waiting for the right moment to move forward again. I took a small bite of pie and nodded along with the conversation, giving them exactly what they expected to see. A cooperative mother enjoying a peaceful dinner. Inside my mind, however, the pieces were beginning to connect. Rosa's warning. The prepared documents. The presence of someone upstairs. The insistence that everything be arranged tonight. All of it pointed towards something larger than a simple conversation about retirement planning. Robert once told me that when several small clues appear in the same room, they usually belong to the same story. The trick is recognizing the story before it reaches its final chapter. I glanced toward the staircase again and noticed something else that had escaped my attention earlier. A faint strip of light was visible beneath the door of Daniel's home office at the top of the stairs. The office door was closed. Daniel rarely closed that door when family visited. My heart remained calm, but my curiosity sharpened. If someone was waiting upstairs, then this evening had more steps left to unfold. I placed my fork down and wiped my hands lightly with my napkin. "Would you mind if I stepped outside for a moment?" I asked casually. The drive was long, and a little fresh air might do me good. Olivia answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Of course, but dessert has just been served." Daniel glanced toward the hallway again before speaking. "You can relax here, Mom. The patio door is open if you want some air." His response was polite, but it also gently redirected me away from the front entrance. Another small piece of information. I smiled reassuringly and shook my head. "That is all right. I think I will stay." Daniel nodded, visibly relieved. Olivia returned her attention to the pie on her plate. Across the room Rosa had paused near the kitchen doorway. When she saw that I remained seated, she gave a faint, almost invisible nod. She understood what I was doing. Leaving abruptly might have ended whatever plan Daniel and Olivia had prepared, but it would also have left the truth hidden. Staying meant the evening would continue to reveal itself. And sometimes the safest way to escape a trap is not to run from it immediately, but to wait until you understand exactly how it closes. I lifted my glass once more and looked at my son across the table. Daniel, I said gently, you mentioned earlier that planning ahead was important. Your father believed the same thing. Daniel smiled politely. He always was a careful man. I nodded slowly, remembering the quiet confidence Robert carried through every decision he made. Yes, I said softly. And one thing he always reminded me of was this. When something important is about to happen, pay attention to every detail in the room. For a brief moment Daniel looked uncertain, as though he were trying to decide whether my words carried a deeper meaning. Olivia remained still beside him, her expression composed. Neither of them realized that I had already begun doing exactly what Robert taught me years ago. I was paying attention. And the longer I sat at that table, the clearer it became that the real purpose of this dinner had not revealed itself yet. But it was getting closer with every passing minute. I kept my gaze steady on Daniel while the quiet rhythm of the evening continued around us, the soft ticking of the wall clock marking each passing second like a patient observer. My husband Robert used to say that silence was often the moment when truth began to surface, and I could feel that moment approaching now. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and lifted his glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. Olivia followed his movement with a glance that lasted just a little too long. It was the kind of glance shared between two people who believed they were managing a situation together. I lowered my eyes toward the dessert plate in front of me and gently set my fork beside it, as though I had finished eating. In reality my attention was still fixed on the faint strip of light beneath the office door upstairs. Someone was there. Someone who had not yet come down to join the evening. Margaret, would you like some coffee? Olivia asked with the same smooth tone she had used all evening. I smiled politely. That would be lovely. She rose from the table and moved toward the kitchen, her steps quiet against the hardwood floor. As she disappeared through the doorway I noticed Daniel glance once more toward the staircase. This time he did not hide it quickly enough. The look lasted barely a second, but it confirmed what I already suspected. The person upstairs mattered to whatever plan they had arranged tonight. Rosa stepped forward to clear the empty dessert plates, her movements calm and practiced. When she reached my place at the table she leaned slightly closer than necessary while lifting the dish. Her voice was almost a whisper. Be careful, she murmured so softly that only I could hear. Then she straightened and carried the plates toward the kitchen without another word. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands loosely together, letting the quiet settle again. Daniel offered a small, polite smile as though nothing unusual had happened. You seem thoughtful tonight, Mom, he said. Everything all right? I met his eyes gently. I was just remembering something your father used to say, I replied. He believed important conversations often happen when people think the evening is already finished. Daniel's smile flickered for the briefest moment before returning. Dad always did enjoy his sayings. I nodded slowly, feeling Robert's calm presence in my memory as clearly as if he were standing beside me. He had taught me to read the space between words, the pauses that revealed intention. Tonight those pauses were everywhere. Olivia returned with 3 coffee cups balanced carefully on a tray. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted across the table as she placed a cup in front of me. I thought this might help after the drive, she said warmly. It is a blend from a little shop downtown. I thanked her and wrapped my hands around the cup, enjoying the warmth of the porcelain against my fingers. Daniel waited until Olivia sat down again before speaking. Mom, he began carefully, there is actually one more thing we hope to discuss tonight. The sentence was delivered gently, but I could feel the structure behind it. The conversation was moving forward again, exactly as planned. I nodded with calm interest. Go on. Daniel glanced toward Olivia, and she gave him a small nod of encouragement. He reached for the leather folder once more but did not open it this time. Instead he rested his hand on top of it as if the documents inside were only part of the story. "You have always trusted us," he said slowly. "And we want to make sure everything in the family remains stable in the future." The words sounded respectful, yet they carried a weight that had not been there earlier in the evening. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "There are a few people who specialize in helping families manage transitions like this," she added. "Professionals who can confirm everything is arranged responsibly." Professionals. The word echoed quietly in my mind. I lifted the coffee cup and took a small sip, letting the warmth settle before responding. "You mean lawyers?" I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated for half a second. "Something like that," he said. "More like advisors. Advisors who waited upstairs with the office door closed and the lights on." The picture was becoming clearer with every passing minute. Rosa's warning had not been exaggerated. This dinner had been organized with several steps, each one designed to guide me toward a decision I had not yet agreed to make. I placed the cup gently back on the table and looked at Daniel with the same steady calm I had maintained all evening. "Your father believed in professional advice as well," I said. "But he also believed that the person seeking advice should choose the advisor." Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup. Daniel shifted in his chair again. Neither of them had expected the conversation to move in that direction. The silence stretched for several seconds, long enough for the ticking clock on the wall to feel almost louder than before. Finally Daniel spoke again. "Of course," he said carefully. "But sometimes it is easier when everything is already arranged." Already arranged. There it was again. The quiet assumption that the evening would unfold according to their preparation. I leaned back slightly and allowed a gentle smile to return to my face. "Daniel," I said softly, "arrangements are only useful when everyone involved understands them." At that exact moment a faint sound came from upstairs. The office door opened slightly, and the strip of light beneath it widened across the hallway floor. Daniel turned his head quickly toward the staircase before catching himself. Olivia did not move at all, but I saw the small tension return to her shoulders. Whoever had been waiting upstairs had just made their presence known. And suddenly the entire structure of the evening felt as though it had reached the next stage of its design. I folded my hands again and looked calmly at my son. "It seems we may have another guest joining us," I said quietly. Daniel's expression froze for a moment, caught between surprise and calculation. For the first time since I arrived that evening, the careful balance of the dinner shifted slightly. Because whatever they had prepared to happen next was no longer hidden behind polite conversation. It was about to walk down the stairs. For a moment no one spoke. The quiet sound of the office door upstairs opening traveled down the hallway like a small signal that the evening had finally reached the moment Daniel and Olivia had been preparing for all along. Daniel straightened in his chair and glanced quickly at Olivia, and I could see the silent conversation pass between them without a single word being spoken. Olivia gave a small nod that seemed to say it was time. I kept my hands folded calmly in my lap and looked toward the staircase just as a man stepped into view at the top of the hallway. He was tall, neatly dressed in a dark gray suit, and carried a leather briefcase in one hand. The overhead light illuminated his face as he paused for a moment before walking down the stairs with careful, measured steps. The air in the dining room shifted slightly as he approached, like the quiet change in pressure before a summer storm. Daniel rose from his chair and offered a polite smile. "Mom, I would like you to meet someone," he said. "This is Mr. Harrison. He helps families organize legal matters." The man extended his hand toward me when he reached the table. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said in a calm professional voice. "It is a pleasure to meet you." I stood slowly and shook his hand, studying his expression with quiet attention. His smile was courteous, but there was something rehearsed in the way he held it, the way someone does when they already know the role they are expected to play. "Good evening," I replied gently. "I was not aware we would have another guest tonight." Daniel chuckled softly, as though the situation were perfectly ordinary. "It was a last-minute decision," he said. Since we were already discussing paperwork, we thought it might be helpful to have a professional present to answer any questions. Olivia gestured toward the empty chair at the end of the table. Please sit, Mr. Harrison. The man placed his briefcase beside the chair and took a seat, his posture straight and composed. Rosa appeared briefly in the doorway, her eyes moving quickly between the four of us before she quietly disappeared back into the kitchen. I could almost feel her concern from across the room. Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase and removed a thin stack of documents that looked very similar to the ones Daniel had already shown me earlier. He placed them carefully on the table and folded his hands together. Your son and daughter-in-law explained that the family has been considering some future planning, he said. These documents simply ensure that financial and medical decisions can be handled efficiently if needed. His tone was professional and steady, the tone of someone who had delivered this explanation many times before. I listened patiently while he spoke, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as they expected. Daniel looked relieved that the conversation had moved into more official territory. Olivia leaned slightly closer to him, her confidence returning now that their prepared expert had joined the room. I glanced briefly at the papers Mr. Harrison had placed on the table. They were almost identical to the ones in Daniel's folder, though the formatting looked more polished. The message was clear. This was not a casual dinner conversation. This was the second stage of a carefully planned arrangement. I lifted my coffee cup and took a small sip before setting it down again. Mr. Harrison, I said calmly, may I ask you a question? He nodded politely. Of course. How long have you been working with my son? The question seemed simple enough, but Daniel shifted slightly in his chair before the man answered. We spoke earlier today, Mr. Harrison replied. Your son wanted to make sure everything was explained clearly. Earlier today. The timing fit perfectly with the sudden dinner invitation I had received that morning. I nodded slowly as if satisfied with the explanation. I see, I said. And do you often visit families during dinner? For the first time that evening Mr. Harrison hesitated. It was only a small pause, but it revealed more than any direct answer could have. Daniel quickly stepped in before the silence lasted too long. Mom, we just wanted everything to be convenient for you, he said. You would not have to make another appointment later. Olivia added a supportive smile. We thought it would save time. Save time. Another carefully chosen phrase. I looked at each of them in turn, allowing the calm quiet in my voice to remain exactly the same. I appreciate efficiency, I said gently. But decisions about my property deserve patience. Mr. Harrison leaned forward slightly. That is completely understandable, Mrs. Whitmore. However, these arrangements are quite common and can provide peace of mind. I folded my hands together again and studied his expression with the same attention Robert had taught me to use when negotiating business agreements. Peace of mind is important, I agreed. But it usually begins with transparency. The word hung in the air for a moment. Daniel's smile faded slightly. Olivia lowered her gaze toward the table. Mr. Harrison adjusted the position of the papers in front of him as though considering how to proceed. Upstairs the office door remained open, the hallway light shining down the staircase like a quiet reminder that this entire meeting had been waiting there before dinner even began. I leaned back slowly in my chair and looked once more at the three faces across the table. Daniel, my son. Olivia, his wife. And the man they had invited to help guide the evening in the direction they wanted. Rosa's warning echoed quietly in my mind again. Run now. But running would mean leaving the story unfinished. And something told me the most important part of this evening had not happened yet. I placed my hands gently on the table and offered a calm smile that revealed nothing about the thoughts forming behind it. Mr. Harrison, I said softly, before we continue, there is something you should probably know about my husband. Daniel's eyes lifted quickly toward mine. Olivia froze beside him. Mr. Harrison waited politely for me to continue. And for the first time since I arrived that evening, I could see a small crack forming in the careful plan they had built around this dinner. I watched Daniel carefully as the room settled into a silence that felt heavier than before. The moment I mentioned my husband, something in his posture changed. It was subtle, but I had known my son for more than 40 years. A mother notices small shifts long before anyone else does. Olivia remained still beside him, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee cup as though the warmth might steady her. Mr. Harrison sat quietly at the end of the table with his hands folded, waiting for me to continue. I allowed the pause to stretch for a few seconds longer before speaking again. My husband Robert believed in preparation, I said gently. He believed that when people make decisions about money or property, they should do it long before pressure ever enters the room. Daniel forced a polite smile. Dad always was careful with planning, he said. That is exactly what we are trying to do tonight. I nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Yes, I replied. But Robert also believed something else. He believed that if anyone ever tried to rush a decision involving our family assets, it meant that someone was hoping the details would not be examined too closely. Mr. Harrison shifted slightly in his chair, and for the first time his professional calm looked less certain. Olivia glanced quickly toward Daniel, and the two of them shared a brief look that lasted only a second. I rested my hands gently on the table and continued speaking with the same calm tone I had used all evening. Many years ago, when Daniel was still in college, Robert and I sat together at our kitchen table reviewing our estate plans. At that time our accountant explained something interesting. He said that families often encounter problems when authority is transferred without careful safeguards. I could see Daniel's attention sharpening now, the polite mask on his face beginning to slip. Mom, he said carefully, these are normal arrangements. I am sure they are, I replied calmly. But Robert always preferred arrangements that included more than one level of protection. I glanced toward the papers in front of Mr. Harrison and then back at my son. For example, Robert believed that any document transferring control of property should never be signed without independent review. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat gently. That is generally good advice, he admitted. However, your son explained that the family wished to simplify matters. I smiled politely. Simplicity is pleasant, I said. But protection is better. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, the patience in his voice beginning to thin. Mom, we are just trying to help you. I looked at him quietly for a moment, remembering the small boy who used to sit at the same kitchen table struggling with his math homework. I know you believe that, I said softly. But there is something else you may not know. Olivia straightened in her chair, her expression suddenly alert. Mr. Harrison's eyes focused on me with renewed interest. The air in the room seemed to grow even stiller. Upstairs the hallway light continued to shine down the staircase like a silent witness to everything happening below. I folded my hands together and spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. Robert made several arrangements before he passed away, I said. Arrangements that were designed specifically for situations where someone might try to guide me into signing documents quickly. Daniel's face tightened slightly. Olivia looked down at the table as though she suddenly found the grain of the wood fascinating. Mr. Harrison sat very still. You see, I continued gently, Robert believed that trust inside a family should never depend on surprise paperwork. The sentence hung in the air for a long moment. Daniel finally spoke again, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. What kind of arrangements are you talking about? I reached for my coffee cup and took a slow sip before answering. The warmth steadied my voice as I placed the cup back down. The kind that ensure no important document can be finalized without outside verification. Mr. Harrison leaned slightly forward now. Outside verification from whom? He asked. I met his gaze calmly. From the attorney who has overseen our family trust for the past 15 years. Daniel blinked. Family trust, he repeated. The word sounded unfamiliar to him. That alone told me how little he truly understood about the financial structure Robert had quietly built long before his health declined. Olivia looked quickly toward him, clearly just as surprised. I allowed a gentle smile to appear, though my voice remained calm. Yes, I said. Robert believed it was wise to organize things carefully. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier pauses in the evening. Before, the silence had belonged to Daniel and Olivia while they waited for me to sign their documents. Now the silence belonged to something else entirely. It belonged to the realization that the situation might not be unfolding the way they expected. Mr. Harrison slowly closed the folder in front of him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said thoughtfully, "your husband sounds like a very prudent man." I nodded once. He was. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression now uncertain in a way I had not seen all evening. Olivia's confident smile had vanished completely. And in that quiet moment I realized that Rosa's warning had not only been about danger. It had also been about timing. Because sometimes the person walking into a trap is not the one sitting calmly at the dinner table. Sometimes the trap is already waiting for the people who believed they were setting it. The silence after my words lingered in the dining room like a held breath that no one seemed ready to release. Daniel sat motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the table as if the polished wood might somehow provide an answer that his thoughts could not yet find. Olivia's composure had begun to slip in small ways that would be invisible to anyone who did not know her well. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of her coffee cup, then stopped when she realized I was watching. Mr. Harrison adjusted the position of the documents in front of him again, but this time the movement felt less confident than before. I let the quiet remain undisturbed because silence often forces people to reveal what they truly think. Finally Daniel leaned forward and clasped his hands together. "Mom," he said slowly, "I do not understand. What trust are you talking about?" His tone was careful now, no longer the calm certainty he had carried earlier in the evening. I lifted my coffee cup once more and took a small sip, giving myself a moment before answering. "Your father believed that responsibility should never rest in one person's hands alone," I said gently. "Especially when it involves family property." Olivia spoke before Daniel could respond. "But Daniel is your son," she said. "Surely you trust him." The question hung in the air with a quiet sharpness that revealed more than she probably intended. I set my cup down and folded my hands together again. "Trust and protection are not the same thing," I replied calmly. "Your father believed in both." Mr. Harrison leaned slightly forward now, his professional interest returning. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "when you mentioned a trust earlier, were you referring to a legal structure that already governs the property?" I nodded once. "Yes." Daniel's head lifted immediately. "What property?" he asked, the surprise in his voice now impossible to hide. For the first time that evening I allowed myself a small smile. "The same property your father and I spent 40 years building," I answered softly. The confusion in Daniel's expression deepened. Olivia looked from him to me and back again as though trying to follow a conversation that had suddenly moved beyond her expectations. Mr. Harrison closed the folder in front of him completely now and rested his hands on top of it. "If a trust already exists," he said carefully, "then certain decisions may indeed require additional approval." I nodded again. "That is correct." Daniel's voice tightened slightly. "Mom, you never told me about any trust." "It never seemed necessary," I said. "Your father handled those matters personally for many years." The room grew quiet again. Outside the window a passing car moved slowly down the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the curtains before fading away. Inside the dining room the air felt cooler than before. Olivia spoke again, though her confidence had begun to fade. "But if everything is already arranged," she said, "then why would you need someone else to manage things in the future?" I looked at her calmly. "Because that was exactly the situation your father anticipated." Daniel blinked. "Anticipated?" I nodded. Robert understood that circumstances change. People change. Even families change. Mr. Harrison studied me carefully now, his earlier certainty replaced with thoughtful curiosity. "May I ask who oversees this trust?" he said. I met his gaze directly. "Our attorney, Mr. Caldwell, in Boston." The name seemed to land heavily in the room. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Boston," he repeated. "Yes," I said quietly. "Robert chose him many years ago." He believed it was important for the trustee to remain independent from family influence. Olivia's fingers tightened around her cup again. Mr. Harrison gave a slow nod. That would make sense. I could see the shift in his thinking now. Earlier he had arrived expecting to guide a simple document signing. Now he was beginning to realize that the legal landscape of this family was far more complicated than Daniel had suggested. I rested my hands calmly on the table and looked at my son. Robert also left instructions that no document affecting the trust could be signed without Mr. Caldwell reviewing it first. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. So even if you wanted to sign these papers tonight, you could not? He asked. I tilted my head gently. Not without violating the terms your father established. Olivia looked toward Daniel with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The confident structure of their evening had begun to unravel piece by piece. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly. In that case, he said, it would indeed be appropriate to consult Mr. Caldwell before proceeding. Daniel's eyes moved quickly between the papers on the table and my face. For the first time since dinner began he looked uncertain about what to say next. I remained perfectly calm, the same quiet mother they had expected when they invited me here earlier that day. But the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The conversation was no longer moving according to the careful script Daniel and Olivia had prepared. Rosa appeared briefly again in the doorway, pretending to adjust a stack of dishes on the counter. Our eyes met for a second and I saw a flicker of relief in her expression. She understood what had just happened. The trap had not closed the way Daniel and Olivia intended. And now the evening had reached a moment none of them had anticipated when the first document was placed on the table. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after Mr. Harrison acknowledged the existence of the trust. The confident rhythm of the evening had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to settle into every corner of the dining room. I could see my son thinking carefully now, measuring each possible response before allowing any words to leave his mouth. Olivia, however, did not have the same patience. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, her earlier composure replaced by a sharper curiosity. So everything is already controlled by this trust? She asked. I met her gaze calmly. Everything important, I said. The answer seemed to land heavily between them. Daniel slowly exhaled and ran a hand across the table as if smoothing an invisible wrinkle in the polished surface. Mom, he said carefully, why did Dad never explain this to me? His voice carried something I had not heard all evening. Uncertainty. I folded my hands together and spoke gently. Your father believed that financial structures should protect the family, not complicate it. Daniel looked down again, clearly trying to follow a situation that had moved beyond the simple plan he and Olivia had prepared earlier that day. Mr. Harrison remained very still at the end of the table, his professional instincts now guiding him to observe more than he spoke. I could see that he had already begun reassessing the entire evening. Olivia shook her head slightly as if trying to reorganize her thoughts. But if there is a trust, she said, then surely Daniel still has authority as your son. I smiled faintly. Authority is not the same thing as responsibility. The words seemed to shift the atmosphere again. Daniel looked up immediately. What does that mean? He asked. I allowed the quiet to stretch for a moment before answering. It means your father wanted decisions about our assets to be made carefully, with oversight from people who were not emotionally involved. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. That is a common safeguard in larger estate structures, he said. Daniel turned toward him. Larger estate, he repeated. Mr. Harrison glanced briefly at me before speaking again. If the trust holds the properties you mentioned earlier, then it likely contains provisions regarding management and approval. Daniel's attention snapped back to me. Properties, he said. The word carried genuine surprise. I rested my hands calmly on the table and spoke with the same steady tone I had maintained all evening. Your father invested in several properties over the years, I explained. Some were purchased through the trust itself. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. How many properties? She asked before she could stop herself. I tilted my head thoughtfully. Enough to ensure stability. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension of the evening. This silence carried realization. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, absorbing the information piece by piece. The careful plan he and Olivia had built earlier now looked much smaller in comparison to the larger structure they had not known existed. I lifted my coffee cup again and took a slow sip while watching them both. Robert had always believed that truth should reveal itself gradually, the way sunlight slowly fills a room in the morning. Daniel finally spoke again, though his voice had changed. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you saying Dad placed everything into this trust?" I nodded once. "Most of it." Olivia looked stunned. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly. "If that is the case," he said, "then the documents presented tonight would indeed require review by the trustee before any signatures could have legal effect." Daniel stared at the folder on the table as if seeing it for the first time. Olivia's earlier confidence had completely disappeared now, replaced by a quiet calculation as she tried to understand the implications. I could see the moment when Daniel realized something important. His eyes lifted slowly toward me. "You already knew about this tonight," he said. It was not quite a question. I returned his gaze gently. "Your father believed I should always understand the structure of our family finances." Daniel nodded slowly, the realization settling into place. Rosa stepped quietly into the dining room again to collect the empty coffee cups. As she passed behind my chair she paused for the briefest moment, and I heard her whisper so softly that only I could catch the words. "You were ready." I did not turn my head, but I allowed myself the smallest smile. Because that was the truth of it. Rosa's note had warned me that something unusual was waiting at this dinner table. But Robert had already prepared me long before tonight ever began. Daniel finally pushed the folder gently away from the center of the table. The documents that had seemed so important earlier now looked strangely irrelevant. "I think we should pause this conversation," he said quietly. Mr. Harrison nodded immediately. "That would be wise." Olivia said nothing at all. The evening that had started as a carefully arranged plan had ended very differently from what she expected. I leaned back in my chair and allowed the calm warmth of the room to return. Outside the window the quiet suburban street remained unchanged, as peaceful as it had been when I first arrived. But inside the house something important had shifted. The trap Daniel and Olivia had prepared had not closed around me. Instead it had revealed something far more valuable than any document on that table. It had revealed the truth about who understood the family Robert had spent a lifetime protecting.